Welcome to my Introduction to Networking course, also known as ITN. This is the version 7 material preparing learners for the Cisco CCNA 200-301. Cisco curriculum, everything is owned and copyrighted by them. Welcome to Module 2, Basic Switch and In-Device Configuration. We're going to be talking about basic Cisco iOS navigation, the command line structure, how to configure a basic Cisco device, how to save the configuration. We're going to talk about some basic port communication and media, talk about how to configure addresses for host devices, and then how we can verify communication between those two devices on a LAN. So we have a lot to cover in this chapter, but most of this is going to be basic layer 2 and basic navigation of the devices. So let's go ahead and jump right in. First section is Cisco iOS. So when we think a computer or a computing device, there is some type of operating system that runs that hardware. And typically the hardware is the physical part. Then the kernel is the communication between the hardware and the software. And then there is the shell, the software portion. We, the user, interact with the shell or software. So we have to have something that will manage between us and the hardware. And that's where that kernel comes into play. More often than not, we think of like a client operating system like Windows 10 or a Mac OS or a Linux OS. But that's not the only thing. Networking devices do have their own operating system. While Windows 10 has a GUI, a graphical user interface, sometimes these GUIs may fail. So we actually have a command line version that works just as well. It's not as graphical, but you don't have to worry about the graphical portion crashing and then you losing the ability to interact with it. So with that, we have certain versions of Linux that are both graphical and command line. So it just kind of depends on what you're looking for and the stability that you are looking for as well. The purpose of an operating system is, again, to allow us to interact with the hardware, but to make it easier. So if we're dealing with a graphical interface, we have a mouse, we have a keyboard, we can move the mouse, we can do things. While we also have a text portion of the operating system, we have a command line that we can also navigate to and from if necessary. Well, in certain operating systems, they don't have a graphical interface, so you can actually choose not to deal with a graphical user interface if necessary. Most Cisco networking devices that we will be dealing with are strictly command line only. So how do we access the command line? We access it through a console cable. This is a traditional console cable up here. It's a DB9 on one side and an RJ45 with a correct pinout on the other. We used to use a program called Telnet to actually connect to a Cisco router. However, Telnet's all plain text and it's not shown to be secure. So that was replaced with Secure Shell, SSH. And this establishes, again, a remote command line, but this allows for encryption, assuming that it has been set up. Both Secure Shell and Telnet can be used when connecting to the networking device's console port. The console port is a management port that is used to, lo and behold, manage the actual device. But that means you have to have physical access to the device. So these types of programs like Telnet and SSH are actually called terminal emulators. They allow us to emulate a terminal to the device. So once we've actually connected to the device, we have to understand our iOS navigation. One of the big things is the different modes, and that's going to be an important thing starting out because how the devices operate is really depending on the mode that they are in. Here we have a a device name like router, switch, and a caret. This is called the exec mode, or the user exec mode. And this allows us very limited access to what we can do. Again, you'll notice the caret. Versus our privilege exec mode, which will be a pound. This allows us access to greater options. So here I dragged a routers in packet tracer. I brought a router up and running, and I just want to access the terminal. So you'll notice we have just our router and our carets. Do question mark, that's what we can do. We can do ping, we can do disable, we can do some basic show commands, and that's it. If I type enable, we'll go to our privilege exec mode, and you'll notice the amount of commands we can do are tremendously, the list we can do is way longer. So again, depending on the mode that we're operating in, we can do different things. And this will become second nature to you as we use the devices more, because it becomes muscle memory at that point. After that, we have our global configuration. You'll notice it will go to a config. If we are configuring a line specific item like a console or a virtual terminal, we will get a line. If we are looking at a interface, we will be actually at a subcommand, the config-if. These are just some of the interfaces, not all of them. So as we dive deeper into the devices, we will actually be reviewing additional config line syntax and whatnot. So again, there is no video for this, but there is a difference between the user exec mode, privilege exec mode, and our global configuration mode, and how we navigate between them, as well as how we issue commands at each one of them. So how do we navigate between them? If we are at a user mode and we want to go to a privilege exec mode, we will do an enable. That allows us to go to our privilege exec mode. If we want to exit out, we will type exit. How do we go to our global configuration? We could type configure terminal, hit enter. That takes us from our privilege exec mode and puts us in our global configuration mode. That would be this guy right here. If we want to go back to our privilege exec mode, we will do exit, and it will take us back to our privilege exec mode. If we want to configure a line console, for example, in our global configuration, we would type line console 0, and that will allow us to go to our line. Some commands can only be issued at certain locations. So depending at where you are located, are you in the config mode? Are you in the config tac line mode? Are you in the config tac if mode? Certain commands can only be issued in certain areas. So we do need to keep that in mind as we are talking about the navigation of the iOS. So again, learning basic line and console navigation. So if we are looking at a line console, again, we have that sub-interface. We can return to the privilege exec mode by doing end or by doing a control Z. End will take us all the way back. Exit takes us one step out. So if we were in the config tac line and we type exit, it'll take us back to the config. End takes us all the way back to our privilege exec mode. The control Z is one that you do want to know. I have seen that pop up on a few exams before, just FYI. So to move directly from one sub configuration console to another, you can actually navigate that way. So if we're at the config tac if and we type line console 0, hit enter, it will take us directly to the config-line. So some of those are just going to be times playing with the command line for us to get familiar with, but don't stress too much. We actually do have a lab coming up that will help us go through that. I have prepared other videos that walk us through the navigation, so you should be good with that. And that is it for this lecture. If you have any questions or concerns, please reach out. Thank you.